First,
sorry, yeah, popping up.
it's okay. Yeah. So, hi everyone, and first of all, thank you from my side for giving me the chance to be here to talk about my work, and I'm really happy about that. So this is a part of the work I've been doing in the past, so in the last 4 years, let's say, and it deals with the observations that were collected during the Eureka campaign. As you can see from the title, it's about observing precipitation in the trades using, well, across different regimes of shallow convection. And the core idea is really to look at different cloud regimes. So let me see if I can go to the next slide. And no, now it doesn't work. Okay. So yeah, let me go one back if I can go one back, just to give you a brief overview of what I want to talk about. Yes. So first of all, I would like to highlight why it's worth keeping an eye again and still on precipitation. And then I will try to introduce you to the precipitation in the trades and to look at precipitation in the trades from different scales. One will be the local scale, exploiting a synergy of observations from the ship where I was on during the campaign. But at the same time, we can look at the same events and the same precipitation also from a different perspective, that is from satellite, exploiting deep learning methods to basically try to understand the spatial patterns that live at the mesoscale. And also look at the transitions from one pattern to the other and how they are linked to the local scale. That is what I'm presenting at the beginning. So let's start. First of all, a very general point that I think sometimes I always forget, that Earth is the only known planet with copious amounts of usable water. And we know that precipitation is an essential variable for life on our planet. We clearly know that when it's too much or too little, we run into troubles. And why it's so complicated and what is difficult about this precipitation is the quantification, because it varies on a huge amount of scales in space and in time. In space, we can have a variability from 300 meters to 50 kilometers. And in time, it can last 15 minutes to days, okay? And there is no way to fit all these events with the same type of observations. And we also have to, I mean, this is also the key aspect of why models struggle to cope with this great variability, because there are so many scales that we have to bring together. And this is also one of the causes why we have so many biases in precipitation. In particular, if we look at, for example, in the tropics, we look at I like to mention the work that was presented at the EGU 2024 in April from Takasuda and Bao, that they were looking at the global icon simulations in the tropics. And basically what they found is that if we look at the precipitating clouds and we compare with the IMERG products, we see that there are too many and too small clouds that are precipitating cells compared to the observed ones that are visible in the IMERG product. And the speculations on the reasons why this is happening are multiple, but the idea is that we are underestimating the subcloud layer mixing. And in particular, there might be a too short triggering of the precipitation, and there might be not enough low-level moistening before the convection is starting. So, and here, to try to understand if these hypotheses that we are doing are real, and if we are going in the right direction to correct the model, observation play a huge role. So our goal with this work is really to provide observation that can, on one side, help to understand the unknown processes that we are dealing with when we look at precipitation. And at the same time, we hope that with these observations, we can support the model development and the quantification of the biases, so the model evaluation somehow. So I hope that I could motivate a little bit why it's worth looking at precipitation in the trades. And now let me introduce a bit the Eureka campaign. I don't know if you are all familiar with this campaign that took place in 2020 from January to February, right before the start of the pandemic that then kept us closed for years at home. So Eureka, I mean, if you're interested on this QR code, you can find the website of the campaign and look at all the observations that were basically conducted. But the goal of the Eureka was to understand the shallow cloud dynamics at different scales, and also to basically tackle the organization at the mesoscale of the cloud regimes and look at how they impact the local environmental conditions. And in particular, in this slide, you can see all the different platforms that were involved in the campaign. So you can see we had 5 different aircrafts, from Halo to smaller aircrafts like the Twin Otter. And it was a project that was a collaboration among a lot of different countries in US, in Europe. So a lot of really Japan, a lot of different people that somehow contributed to this or helped to promote the Eureka campaign. You can see that we had sail drones, we had ocean gliders, and then we had a site on the Barbados Cloud Observatory, where multiple set of ground-based remote sensing instrumentation profiling the atmosphere were operating next to the Poldirad. And then we had 4 different ships that were spanning the ocean east of Barbados Island. I was on the research vessel Marias Mariam. And in this slide, you can see the area that was spanned in the campaign. So on the bottom, you can see we are talking about the Atlantic Ocean east of Barbados, along the coast of South America. And we can see that there were 2 main directions of operation. One was the trade wind alley between 12.5 and 14.5 degrees north, and the other one was the Boulevard de Tourbillon, so called. Why this name? This name is because in this region there are a lot of oceanic eddies that evolve going up along the coast, and one of the ideas of the platform deployed in this area was exactly to study the impact of these oceanic mesoscale eddies and the air-sea interaction that they develop and the cloud physics that comes as a consequence of this. So keep in mind this structure, then let me present you the approach of this work. So as I said before, we try to have a multi-scale approach. What does that mean? We were on the research vessel Marias and Mariam, as I said before, and from this ship, we could detect the local scale dynamics. So we collected observation continuously from this ship. I will tell you more about that in a moment. But we could then create a statistical approach to exploit all these instruments together to understand how the precipitation forms and impacts the environment below the cloud base. But this is not the only approach. So this is the local scale, but at the same time, we can also look at the mesoscale. So we use satellite observations, and we try to develop a representation of the clouds based on machine learning approaches that highlights the diversity of the cloud spectrum, highlighting different regimes and transitions among these regimes. So let's start. And let's start with the local scale. So as I said, the data that we use for the local scale analysis are all from the Marias Mariam. On the left here, you can see the list of the instruments that were on board. And we had a cloud radar, we had a micro-rain radar, and then we also had Raman LiDAR and Doppler LiDARs that were essential to measure the properties of the subcloud layer. In the figure here, you can see we have maybe I can also show you with the pointer. This one here was the cloud radar. This one is the MRR, and both were installed on this horizontal platform with this brown curtain that is called, this is basically the stabilization platform that is there to compensate for ship motion. And on the right, instead, you can see the track that the ship covered during the campaign as a function of time from the 19th of January to the 19th of February. And so what can we get out of all these observations? I mean, there were also radio soundings, but the analysis that I'm presenting is mainly focusing on the observations from these 4 instruments. So first of all, to derive a statistic, we need to have a way to classify our clouds. And in this work, what we decided to adopt is the standard classification of clouds that was presented first in, I think, in Jacob et al. In 2020. This is the first paper where I found this same distinction. Basically, the idea is that we distinguish clouds based on where the cloud top is with respect to the lifting condensation level. So we call shallow clouds all the clouds that have a cloud top within 600 meters from the lifting condensation level. And we call congestus clouds all the shallow convection clouds that have a cloud top that is above 600 meters, but within 4 kilometers from the lifting condensation level. And this distinction of these two types of clouds is also present in papers that came afterwards, the paper from Marek Jakob. So this is, I think it's a very well accepted distinction of these cloud types in the community. On the left, you can see the occurrence of cloud base height and cloud top height. So each dot here so each color represents the number of counts of clouds that have a cloud top at that height, at cloud base at that height. And you can clearly see that there are some modes. One is a mode of very shallow clouds with cloud top not far from cloud base. And the other is a mode that has a cloud top that is much higher than cloud base. And sometimes cloud base is also below the lifting condensation level, indicating the possibility of having virga or precipitation. This is the classification we used. And now let me show you a bit of statistics about that. So the first thing we decided to look at was how do clouds develop with respect to the liquid water amount that are present in the cloud. So we basically grouped the reflectivity beams observed from the radar as a function of ranges in liquid water path that we measured with the vertical profiling instruments. And you can see in A, we have the first group with the liquid water path smaller than 10, then smaller than 50, smaller than 100, then 300, and then smaller than 1000, which is a range even very, very high, or also to measure properly from the ground. And you see that in each of these panels, we plotted the amount, so the occurrence of reflectivity as a function of elevation. So where you see the highest colors in orange, that means that there you have the highest occurrence of pixels. But here you can also see that we split the shallow that are represented by contour lines in grayscale from the congestus clouds that are represented by shades. So what can we learn from this evolution panel? So these panels that describe how the clouds change with the amount of liquid. If you just look at the upper part of the panel, in the lower part there is just the total without the distinction in terms of liquid water path. So if you look at the first upper part of the panel, you can see that as the liquid water path increases, you see that the shallow clouds have an elongated shape towards higher and larger values of reflectivity in the higher part of the cloud. But then you can also see that they barely exceed the values of 100 grams per square meter. That means they hardly precipitate. If we look instead at the congestus clouds, you can really see that in the upper part of the cloud, you have a high occurrence of reflectivity beams, always below minus 20 dBz. But then the more you increase in the liquid, the more there is a transition of reflectivities to higher values, more or less at the same height, until this range of liquid water path. And between this range and this range, you start to see that you start to have the onset of precipitation. Reflectivity is increasing from minus 20 to higher values in reflectivity. And you also start to see that there is a trend of reflectivity values high that decrease in altitude. And this is basically due to the precipitation in the cloud that start to precipitate. And here you can see it clearly that it goes to the ground. So if we look at that in the cumulative, so the total pixels altogether, you can really see this adiabatic evolution of the shallow clouds in the lower part. And then you can see the upper part that grows with reflectivity. And then you can see the part of precipitation to the right of that. For any question, maybe at the end, but take note, I don't know. Or if you want to interrupt me, please do so. I don't know how you're more comfortable. So let me go to the next slide where I want to show you. We also look at the diurnal cycle of these clouds because we wanted to see if there was a variability during the day. And we split the shallow from the congestus. And here we can see something very interesting. These are plotted in the upper panel, you see the shallow clouds, and in the lower panel, you see the congestus clouds as a function of local time, which is UTC -4. So it's very nice to see that actually shallow clouds do not show a clear diurnal cycle in their occurrence. They are present more or less all over the day, while congestus clouds are more rare during the afternoon. You can see that here from 12 to 4, there is a sort of reduction of the amount of cloudiness that you can see. Here we are talking about hydrometeor fraction, so we don't split clouds from virga or precipitation. And this is also relevant, and I have another slide on this, because we saw that precipitation is mainly coming from congestus clouds. So the question we had was if this signature, this diurnality that we see here was due to precipitation or not. So we split it in the congestus, the precipitation part from the non-precipitation part. And this is the result. In the upper part, you can see the congestus precipitating part. And here we flag the precipitation based on the presence of precipitation at the ground, and with the weather station that we had on the ship. And in the other case, you see the congestus non-rainy cases. And here you see also very interesting that precipitation from congestus clouds can occur again quite any time. There is no diurnality in this. And we were quite surprised by this result. Let me tell you something else. Okay, we talked about precipitation, but then how does convection initiate? And this is something we try to describe in these plots. Unfortunately, I didn't make it for this presentation to also have a plot that describes the thermodynamic in the subcloud layer. It's a work in progress, but I didn't make it. So here we just discussed the dynamical aspects. And on the left, you see the anomalies of vertical velocity from wind lidar observation in the upper panel for non-precipitating clouds, in the lower panel for precipitating clouds. And on the right, instead, we look at in-cloud pixel as seen from the cloud radar. And we see on the y-axis, we have the mean Doppler velocity in meter per second as a function of radar reflectivity on the x-axis. And here again, we have contour lines for shallow clouds and shades for congestus clouds. All these data are from the W-band. So what can we say here about what we are seeing? So first of all, if we start from the shallow clouds, we saw that most of them are non-precipitating. We can see both in the subcloud layer, they have a tiny positive updrafts ranging from 0.2 to 0.5 meter per second in mean. And this is also visible in the cloud. If you look at this, I mean, here we are making a big approximation that the mean Doppler velocity is a proxy for the air motion in the cloud, which is partially true in a sense that this is a result of a convolution of other elements, in particular also turbulence, the fall speed of the droplets. So it's not totally true, but at least for small droplets, when there is not too much turbulence, this might be assumed as a quite decent proxy, let's say. So here, what you can see is that they have so the maximum peak for shallow clouds is again between 0.2 and 0.5 meter per second, with a slanted, basically this distribution has a positive tail towards positive values of Doppler velocity in the cloud, which would make sense for an updraft that grows, then you start to have condensation and still goes on in the cloud somehow. If we look at the congestus clouds instead, what we see is that we mainly have downward velocity in the subcloud layer, probably due to the precipitating part. And we still see also in the cloud that we have negative velocities, negative mean Doppler velocities due to the precipitating hydrometer that are here increasing also in the reflectivity. And this was something that in a statistical sense was interesting to notice from these observations. But of course, we can also look at what is the impact that virga, for example, so evaporation, precipitation that is evaporating before reaching the ground, can have on the subcloud layer. And here what we are looking at is just for shallow clouds, the anomalies of air temperature, mixing ratio, and vertical wind from left to right as a function of virga depth and elevation. So virga depth is the vertical extent of the virga below cloud base. So from cloud base where the virga is basically completely evaporated. And here you can see also that we plotted a dashed line that is basically the mean cloud base height as a function of virga depth bins. And the grayish area is the uncertainty about the cloud base height. So what can we see for shallow clouds? Mainly, first of all, we have to consider that the virga depth distribution for shallow is the orange one here, and is mainly shows that virga depths are mainly below 400 meters. So they are very tiny, very narrow. That means there is little amount of virga that can evaporate in these conditions. Our concept for interpreting these anomalies is the following. So we have small raindrops that can evaporate when they get out of the cloud below cloud base. And in this process of evaporation, they of course suck energy from the environment from the subcloud layer to become water vapor. So we expect to see colder temperature below cloud base and higher humidity below cloud base. And this is what we try to, basically, this is how we interpret this cooling that you see below cloud base, this part, and this increase in mixing ratio, because there is a positive anomaly. That means there is air that is more humid than normal below the cloud base. What is also interesting to notice is that this virga precipitating is not strong enough to deplete the subcloud updraft that we also saw in the previous slide, if you remember what we talked about, the convection initiation. This for shallow, but what happens for congestus clouds? For congestus, the picture is a bit different, because again, you see the same plots, but now if we look at the virga for congestus clouds, we see that we also have higher values of virga depths. So that means that the virga has a longer extension in the subcloud layer before evaporating. And here what we see is that we have stronger negative anomalies of temperature, air temperature. We have almost zero anomaly in vertical wind. That means somehow the updrafts are more depleted than before. And we have a negative anomaly in mixing ratio. And now, how can we explain this negative mixing ratio anomaly? So the only explanation that we could find, and maybe it would be nice to discuss with you all, is that despite the evaporation of this virga below cloud base and the colder temperature that this evaporation is causing, we hypothesize that there might be some downdrafts of colder and drier air that comes from the upper layers that is associated with the downdrafts that we are seeing in these virga cases. Of course, we don't have a proof for this, so this is just our speculation, but it would be cool to get to know what you think about that. Okay, so what about rain? We also could derive the profiles of raindrop size distribution, and this is a statistic that I compiled for the whole campaign, looking mainly at congestus clouds. And what we can see is that actually, as a function of elevation in this upper panel here, you see that the small droplets reduce when you go closer to the ground, and the larger droplets increase. So what can explain this is, of course, the evaporation of the smaller droplets, but also the collision with the larger drops while they fall, which might be also a reason why they increase in number. And of course, this rain is causing anomalies at the surface in air temperature and humidity. And you can see that the anomaly is much stronger in case of congestus clouds, that is the green curve for air temperature, with respect to the orange curve of the shallow, and the same also for the relative humidity. We can reach up to -4 degrees anomalies in temperature and 20% anomaly in increase in surface humidity due to congestus precipitation. So let me try to basically, let me show you one other thing that I wanted to show. So there is also some work in progress at the moment that I'm bringing forward together with Raffaella Fogel and Dominique Bugnol. We are trying to retrieve the evaporation rate, because in the previous slide, we saw here that these small droplets evaporate. So we are trying to quantify the evaporation rate of precipitation as a function of elevation using the approach that was presented in Tridon et al. In 2027. And this approach needs to have a synergy of different observations, of profiling observations, which is what we have in this case, because we have the drop size distribution from the MRR, and then we have the Raman LiDAR that gives us profiles of temperature and humidity and vertical velocity. And we can thus correct the drop size distribution for vertical velocity and then combine these observations to retrieve an evaporation rate profile. So here on the bottom, you can see our first case study in which we were able to retrieve this evaporation rate. And here you can see the percentiles of the evaporation rate that we found for this case. It's work in progress, it's nothing definitive, and we are trying to find a way to also evaluate our retrieval, and for this is why we are working together also with Raffaella and Dominique. So let me recap briefly what I've been telling you up to now. So we saw that using ground-based observations, we could statistically characterize the cloud evolution and the diurnal cycle of clouds and precipitation. We also saw that we could characterize the subcloud layer in virga conditions. And we saw that we could describe the raindrop size variability with elevation. So one can ask, okay, what is this all useful for? And of course, in my perspective, this is just a benchmark data set for model evaluation in the trades. So the idea is that people can use these observations to try to see if with models you get to the same results or something different. But at the beginning, I was promising to also have a multi-scale approach. So let me now go to the part of work that we did using satellite observation. So what we did is basically to develop a representation of the clouds that highlights the different regimes, cloud spectrum regimes, and how one can go from one regime to the other. So this is nothing new in reality. There is a lot of literature, and I'm just not presenting here all the literature that is available on this topic. I'm just mentioning the work from Stevens et al. Because a lot of research was done after this work to characterize these patterns that were identified. So here, scientists sat together to classify satellite images, and they found an agreement to reduce the patterns that could be identified in 4 types that are basically the sugar, the gravel, the fish, and the flower that are basically reproduced here. And basically they could use these types. So for every image, they could assign a label to the pattern based on what their eyes were able to detect as a pattern. It's a great idea, I think, and we saw that there are different radiative properties associated with these different patterns. However, when we tried to use this classification with our data, thanks to Isabel McCoy that was providing us the classification of this data, we realized that the 4 classes were not enough to classify all the clouds that we were observing on our track. And in particular, in this plot, you can see that the labeled images were only available for the track that is colored, and everything else was unclassified. And this reflects the general statistic that they reported in their paper, that basically it doesn't result, they were able to classify more or less 50% of the samples. And we also noticed on the ship track classification that there were some cases of misclassification. For example, we had one deep convective case during our track that was classified as a flower, but was with having a cloud top reaching 8,000 meters. And so, and also the other problem that we noticed is that with this group, with these classes, we couldn't represent the transition from one class to the other. So we tried, well, we had some needs for a different deep learning approach. And what were our specific needs? On one side, we deal with a rich and long-term data set of satellite data, but without any label. So we don't have a label for each satellite images. And we wanted an algorithm that was able to identify low-level feature in images and distinguish these images based on these low-level features. What am I talking about when I say low-level features? I'm talking about cloud shapes, fragmentation of patterns, area of clouds, size of the clouds, color patterns. So all these semantics that rely in these satellite images that our eye can capture by instinct, but are not so explicit for a machine learning model. And we want the machine learning model to be able to see these things and learn from that. And then we want this model to be able to characterize the transition between a regime A of cloud type and a regime B of cloud type. So how to do this? The idea was to put together some building blocks for our deep learning algorithm. So the first one is that we want to learn by using the principle of contrastive learning. What is contrastive learning? Is basically the idea that we want to learn general features of a data set without labels by teaching which data points are similar or different in a comparison among pairs. So let's make an example. I guess that you all are looking at this slide and you have no problems in identifying that the first two are 2 cats and the second line, it's a cat and a dog. So it means that our brain could recognize similarities and differences between these pairs of images and learn from this comparison high-level features of the objects. So we want that our model, our machine learning model, look at which pairs of data points are similar and different to learn high-level features. Okay, how to do that? We need to build pairs that are constructed so that we can do this task. How to do this? That's the second building block. We use self-supervision. the idea is that the recipe to build these pairs from which we want to learn is to use data augmentation. Data augmentation means, for example, that we do crop one image and we do flip one image. So we build pairs by reducing the area or taking different parts of the same area with a bit of overposition, or we just take the image and then rotate the image. And then we have a pair with the first image and the second image rotated. So in a self-supervised approach, we don't have any labels, but we ask the model to learn that this combination, so these pairs that are created using this augmentation, so either cropping or flipping, are similar because they are in the end just different versions of the same original image. And this is the concept. So what else we need? We need an encoder. That is something that creates a vector representation of an input image. And for us, the encoder was basically a convolutional neural network, like ResNet, for example. If you're curious to know what we are using, that's the reference you can check. Why convolution? Why convolution and nothing else? Because convolution have the property to be able to capture the contextual and spatial relationships between nearby pixels in the data. So geophysical data, and in particular meteorological data, do show relationships between nearby pixels that are contextual and spatial. We don't have discontinuous random fields. We have continuous fields or the slowly varying fields, as you can see in this image. So the context of the nearby pixel is what we want to learn. So just putting everything together. So this is the structure of our network. We have our twin images in input, the first and the augmented image on the second branch, which might be flipped or cropped or whatever. Then we have our ResNet, so our convolutional network. And then we end up with our vector representation. In the middle here, you can see there is these dense layers. This is called projection head, and it's just a tool to reduce the dimensionality of this vector. This basically is able to reduce this from a dimension of 4,000 elements to 128 elements. So then the point is how to make the network learn. The network learns by comparing the vectors Z1 and Z2 using as a metric the cosine of the angle between the two vectors. And we have high similarity when the angle between the two vectors is close to 0, and low similarity when the angle between the two vectors is far from 0. As you can see between the light blue and the red, in this case, low similarity, or high similarity in this hypersphere. And we build a loss function. I don't want to give you the details, but the loss function is based on this metric and is supposed to minimize the distance between the vectors. So the models learn by iteration. So we provide a lot of images in input, a lot of pairs in input, and it learns step by step and iteration after iteration to put in this multidimensional space the images that are close, so that have a high similarity in the same region of the feature space. So this is, imagine that we run the algorithm for a long time, and at some point, let's say the algorithm converges, and we stop the iterations, and we end up with a feature space that is 128 dimensions, so it's really hard to visualize. And so the first step is, how can we visualize that? We reduce these 128 dimensions to 2 dimensions, and what you see here is a representation of this feature space. So what we have in this feature space is that by continuing training the models, it learns to cluster similar data points in the latent space. So you can see, for example, that all these points that have this orange border have similar images in the same area, like all these ones that you see in this part with these extended clouds, or these ones here that look like flowers, or these ones that have this broadened shape. So the model was somehow able to group similar images in different areas of this feature space. What we could also do is to basically identify discrete classes from this feature space. And these are the classes that we could identify from 1 to 7. And we could also estimate some physical properties of these classes. For example, there's cloud fraction and integrated water vapor. And here, for example, it's look at the class 3, that is the class with the cloud fraction highest at 76%, and integrated water vapor of 47, which is also the highest one. So what is the added value of this? Is that in this feature space, we can look at transitions. So we can look at the evolution in time of a scene as it evolves and where it goes in the feature space, if it goes from one regime to another regime. Okay, let me make an example of this evolution. So what we did, we put together the ship-based observations and the satellite observations. We cropped satellite images on the ship track while the ship was moving from this point to this other point. And the ship was, by construction, always in the center of the image. And here you see the evolution of the satellite images with the ship in the middle over the 10 hours in which we were observing this transition. And here you can see that we know from the classification that at 15 o'clock in the afternoon, there is a transition from class 5 to class 3. Now we looked at the time series of the ship-based observations during this time frame. So this is the time series of the observations from I think 11 or no, maybe 11 in the morning until 15 in the afternoon. And here you can see this is the snapshot of the satellite at this timestamp where you have these blue lights. And this in the white square is the centroid image of the class. That is the most representative image of that class, that is the class 5. And in these panels, we see all the surface-based, so the ship-based observations. After 3 o'clock, what we see is that this is the next class that starts at 5 and goes on in the afternoon. And here you see this snapshot is taken from this timestamp. So what is relevant to see here is that on the ship-based observations, we clearly see that the local conditions have changed in the moment in which we see the transition between class 5 to class 3. In particular, you can see that the liquid water path starts to have much higher values. You can see anomalies in mixing ratio that is increasing a lot, white is, decreasing a lot, white is a negative anomaly. So it's dry air coming down here. And also in these other spots in which we have precipitation, here you have the rain rate. And then you can also see the effect of the surface for surface relative humidity and surface temperature. You can see the decrease of surface temperature due to precipitation and the cold pool associated with the precipitation event, and increasing surface relative humidity. And finally, you can also see the horizontal wind speed anomalies that are associated with the cold pool spread when it comes to the surface. So I think the point here is really to show that we are connecting the two scales, and we see a connection that exists between the two scales. And at the moment, we are doing more research in this direction. So let me wrap up. The first part I was showing you already. We have been discussing this. And the final point is that we have this deep learning classification approach to characterize the transition and all cloud patterns using space semantics. I have just one slide that I wanted to show you, that is the outlook of this, because one direction in which we want to go is to combine the input to ground-based data set and the satellite data as input data for the AI, for the deep learning method, to provide more informed learning to the AI. The other is to characterize the evaporation rate as a function of different environmental conditions and compare what we observe with also SAR observations that were from Dominique Bugnol, for example. And also we are looking for models that want to be evaluated with those observations, because the idea would be to really compare with LES or other models that are providing some sort of output in this statistical sense. And with this, I would like to stop here and looking forward to your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Claudia.